At Lyft Economy, we thought long and hard about including ads on the show, and we decided to only work with high-impact companies that align with our values. Therefore, our first sponsor is Clearinghouse CDFI. Clearinghouse CDFI addresses unmet credit needs in California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and sovereign nations in the western United States. For 22 years, Clearinghouse CDFI has helped bridge the gap between conventional lending standards and the needs of low-income and distressed communities. Clearinghouse CDFI is also a B Corp, a certification received from the nonprofit B Lab. B Corps are companies who meet rigorous standards of social and environmental performance, transparency, and accountability, and use business as a force for good. More information is available at www.ccdfi.com. Once again, that is www.ccdfi.com. At the end of today's episode, stay tuned for a 5-minute mini interview with Doug Bistry, CEO of Clearinghouse CDFI. Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm your host, Andrew Baskin. The goal of this interview series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, diverse, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good.
In this episode of Next Economy Now, Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy, interviews Edgar Villanueva. Edgar is a nationally recognized expert on social justice philanthropy. He currently serves as chair of the board of directors of Native Americans in Philanthropy and is a board member of the Andrus Family Foundation, a national foundation that works to improve outcomes for vulnerable youth. Edgar is the author of Decolonizing Wealth, which offers hopeful and compelling alternatives to the dynamics of colonization in the philanthropic and social finance sectors. So without further ado, please enjoy Ryan Honeyman's conversation with Edgar Villanueva.
Edgar, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm really happy to be here today.
Great. Let's start with a bit about your background. How did you first get interested in the type of work you're doing today?
Well, like a lot of people who work in philanthropy, I stumbled into the field. I did not know that it existed really. And especially being a person who comes from a very low-income family and community, institutional philanthropy was something that was very foreign to me. But I had gone to school for public health and was working in the nonprofit sector for a number of years, doing health equity type work in communities. And I was recruited by a foundation. And so I went to the interview and sort of understood that my job was to invest millions of dollars around the state of North Carolina to improve the health of communities. And I had a lot of friends and mentors saying, "Oh my God, this is a great job, you got to take it." So I took the job not fully understanding what philanthropy was or what the foundation investment world looked like. And really had a great experience, but you kind of don't know until you get on the inside. And so just kind of happenstance fell into it and have been really learning about how I can be more of an advocate to support, equity and racial justice through the years.
Awesome. And, your story to that, can you speak a little bit about the rarity of someone of Native American ancestry being in philanthropy, and perhaps it's still probably, you can maybe count on two hands like other folks. Yeah. Speak a little about that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. I think when I started in philanthropy, I was maybe one of 10 people that I knew of that worked in institutional philanthropy. And as you look at other types of, investment organizations, it probably is a much smaller number. Today, I can probably name about 25 people. So we're still a very small group of folks. And I think it's for a couple of reasons. In general, in the space of philanthropy, philanthropy is a difficult place, I think, for people of color to be successful for a number of reasons. It's a very white dominant culture. It's very insular. There are a limited number of jobs, and so we've seen through the years a number of diversity efforts to increase the number of people who work in philanthropy. And then we've seen in recent times a number of people of color actually decreasing due to some of the dynamics and challenges of working inside of the space.
Yeah, and I love that. I will say to the listeners, Decolonizing Wealth is one of my top 5 books. I think of all time. I might go there. Definitely the last few years, because I've similarly, there seems to be a really good reflective zeitgeist at the moment of sort of looking at, unarmed Giri Haridas's book, Winners Take All, being another example. But there seems to be a lot of momentum around examining what we think, examining things we're doing that we think are helping and are actually perpetuating white supremacy and colonialism. And could you speak a little bit about, how you came to that realization, and just sort of like, what are some of the things that you've noticed working in the field that folks should be aware of that are sort of leading to that perpetualization of systemic oppression?
Yeah, I think like most people, when you think of philanthropy and charity, social impact investing, there's a veneer of goodness and kindness, and to that people assume connected to that work. And I do believe that's true in general. I don't think that most people who work in philanthropy get up in the morning and say, I can't wait to go to work to be racist today. But what I realized once I was on the inside, that philanthropy, there were so many things that were, just really counterintuitive and unjust, that were baked into the systems and the processes. In short, when you examine who makes decisions within these institutions and who has power, and who, actually benefits from the resources and who's not benefiting from the resources, in spite of what the mission, may say on the website or on the wall of the foundation, so few resources are actually being invested in communities of color. And so in the book, I share some of my personal experiences of being from the community, doing what I felt like was an alignment to the foundation strategy and to the goal of the foundation, by moving resources into the community and to supporting organizations led by people of color, only to find that there was resistance to that and challenges to that. And I actually, in some cases, felt punished by asking why not, why it wasn't happening. And so there, through all of these activities and sharing this story and sharing these experiences with other people of color and women and marginalized folks who work in this space, I found that it wasn't just me. There is a trend when you look at what's going on in institutions that move control money, and ultimately I think they're broken, and they are perpetuating in many cases processes and systems that are further destabilizing our communities and perpetuating sort of racist systems.
And for folks who maybe don't know, how do you define, say, colonization or decolonization, and like what that actually means in the context of philanthropy or finance?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when we hear the word colonization, I think it's very normalized for us because we learned about it in school. It's in our history books. And we also think of it as something that happened 500 years ago or 200 years ago. And so sort of a retro word that I'm helping to bring back, because I think what colonization is something that continues to happen. It's happening right now. If you watch the evening news, we see colonization happening. And ultimately, colonization is just a force. It's a force that has the mantra of separating and dividing, conquering, exploiting people, all for the sake of accumulating wealth. And so those types of what I call the colonizing virus is something that touched our shores 500 years ago, and has just pervaded every aspect of our being. In America especially, we are really wired to think about accumulating more and more and more. We don't know the concept of enough in this country. Like, when are we rich enough? And so that type of mentality, that mantra of colonization, of needing more and more and more, and exploiting anyone or exploiting the land in the process, is something that is reflected now in our policies and in our infrastructure, and especially in the realms of wealth and finance and philanthropy. You see that colonizing virus or those dynamics of colonization showing up.
And we had talked about this a little bit beforehand. And I think in the beginning of the book, you say something around, it's like sort of we all are one. Like, there's no such thing as like separate selves. But the sort of myth of separation was perhaps like the first break for us to like the first sort of false belief that then created sort of white supremacy or colonization. And so I'm kind of curious how you see how we got to where we are from that sort of maybe initial break with being all one to sort of creating these colonist or white supremacist ideas. How do you see that progression happening?
Yeah, so I think whiteness is a concept that was created, right? It's a myth. The idea that anyone is superior or better because of the pigment of their skin is something that was created to create that separation. In order for us to get to a point where we were able to commit genocide, enslave people, exploit folks, low-wage workers, to harm the land, we have to be in a mindset that we are not connected to those folks, and those folks may be even less than human, right? And what fueled that mindset is actually a God-given, a God-given superiority, that not only are we separate, but we are better, and we are, and that state is actually justified by God. And so that's how you see things happening in our history through the years. And even recently, a generation and a half ago or 2 generations ago, where Native children were taken away from their families and forced into boarding schools, all types of horrific abuses happening, stripped of culture and language. The folks who were doing those acts had to completely be absorbed and possessed with this idea that these people are not human. They are not the same. I'm helping them. God has called me to help them and force this on them in the name of salvation. And so that idea of separation is so counter Native. The indigenous worldview is that we are all connected. We're connected to the land. We're connected to animals. And I even talk in the book about the idea of livestock, and when folks begin to think of animals as livestock and something that is owned. And the major difference between being indigenous and non-indigenous, as someone described, is that the indigenous worldview is that we believe that we belong to the land, and the non-indigenous worldview is that we believe the land belongs to us. And that idea of ownership is so inherent in everything when we talk about equity. Like the equity is like a conversation that we're bouncing around a lot in this space, in business and in philanthropy. But what equity really actually means is shared ownership and power. And that's what this is really all about, is actually pushing forward an idea of where we can actually reverse that, those imbalances and share power.
And so do you see white supremacy as a sort of offshoot of the colonial mindset, or are they how do you I'm just curious how you relate those two terms in your own mind?
Let's see, in my mind, I think of white supremacy as the mindset, or the it's something that is driven from fear, right? It's driven from, it's a belief that is not real, but it comes from a place of fear and scarcity within itself, right? And that idea of being superior then leads to the action of colonization. So I think of colonization as an action of how people are responding or behaving based off of their idea of supremacy.
Okay, that's super helpful for me. And in the book, one of the things I really appreciate is you brought the Native American perspective on the 7 steps to healing. Could you talk a little bit about those 7 steps and sort of how you see us moving forward? Sort of you sort of do a great job of saying we're here, and here's sort of from a Native American perspective, here's some medicine, potentially to bring to this current situation.
Yeah. So, I do think there's, my critique in this book of the accumulation of wealth is really around the trauma that it's caused. I am not anti-wealth. I am not anti-money. And I actually make the case in the book that money is neutral. And if money is neutral, then it can actually be used for the good. And so in the indigenous world, we have a concept of medicine. Anything could be medicine that is something that brings us balance and joy, and it really helps restore us. So, for example, if I'm having kind of a blah day, and I may have a certain friend that I call that's always going to crack me up on the phone and make me feel better, right? So that's like medicine for me. And so if we think about money as medicine, and those of us who work in organizations where we are gatekeepers for resources, we can actually deploy resources in a way that helps to promote healing. We cannot undo colonization. Like, colonization has happened. Here we are 500 years later. When you think about decolonizing wealth, that idea, decolonizing, taken literally, it really gets stuck as a political process, because that would literally mean that all the land is turned back over, all the sovereignty is reinstated. To some people, it may mean that like the settlers leave and go back to wherever. And that's really unrealistic in the 21st century, when our businesses and families are all intertwined. And so the idea of healing and the 7 steps of healing is actually examining the trauma that colonization has caused. And then the idea of decolonizing wealth is thinking about how can wealth be used in a way that facilitates healing from that trauma. And so that's, again, thinking of money as medicine. If we're moving money to where the hurt is the worst, then we are helping to invest resources in a way that is, reconnecting us, repairing us, and supporting that healing and restoration of our communities that have been so polarized by these ideas of colonization.
It's funny because when you mentioned in the book, it's even as progressive, I would consider myself progressive white guy. It was like, oh yeah, the British are the colonizers or something. It's like you sort of, it is like very necessary even for me to realize like I am a colonizer here in the United States. It's not just like this, because I feel like a lot of American textbooks, like the British were like everywhere and like owned a fifth of the world. And it's sort of like, oh yeah, and then there were some Native Americans here, but look at, so I really appreciate the book. Yeah.
No, it's a really good point. And I think, even for me being Native American, I share my personal experience, and, I'm vulnerable in the book. And although I'm Native, I have also participated in colonizing behavior. We are, kind of swimming in the water of all of this. And if we're not intentional about our decisions and sort of, deeply reflecting on our analysis around this stuff, it's very easy to sort of assimilate to doing business or making investments or practicing philanthropy in a way that is dominant culture and could actually potentially be harmful. And especially in philanthropy, as a person of color who got in this field, that was one of the few, there was a forced assimilation. And I knew that in order to succeed in this space, I had to be more like them. There was a part of me that I had to give up. Now, I wasn't aware at the time that a lot of this was happening. I was just like, oh, this is what a good funder does. This is what, the leadership that I saw modeled around me make these kinds of decisions. And so it was only after years of doing work in that way and beginning to see what was happening behind the curtain, and then also beginning to feel so deeply disconnected from myself and from my own calling and from my own community, that I had to stop and say, wow, I need to decolonize my own life and my own thinking around this work. And so I share some of those stories, and I think all of us, like the colonizer virus really impacts us, whether we're a person of color, indigenous, or white. And the trauma from colonization also impacts all of us, regardless of whether we are descendants of settlers or we're descendants of folks who were colonized. The trauma from all of that history impacts all of us in different ways.
One of the things that also I get frustrated by, and I know it's like even noticing one of the parts of white supremacy is like moving quickly and like moving past grief towards action. Yeah. So I'm being aware of like my own sort of like desire to like, okay, I see a problem, let's fix it very fast. However, I'm curious how you view, like reading your book, talking about how, wealth was accumulated off of, the environment, stealing land from Native Americans and on the backs of African Americans in slavery, primarily. And then it was stolen twice because we don't pay taxes on the money. so you sort of have like stolen money twice.
Right.
And it sort of leads me to believe that like, if you are a foundation or a wealthy person, should you not within like why should any foundations be in perpetuity? Like, why should they not all spin down to zero within 5 years or like 1 year? What do you have any thoughts on like sort of like that redistribution of wealth that needs to happen? And like, what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really complicated, and you're definitely right, Ryan. I think of this money as twice stolen, because and what's really unjust in that is that foundations, for example, kind of slicing off just part of the social impact world, are sitting on $800 billion of wealth, and then are only required by the U.S. government to pay out 5% of grants, and then of that 5%. A very small percentage, our best year so far is that 8% of the 5% was invested in communities of color. And so what you see there is a huge injustice with foundations focused more on accumulating more wealth, only regranting out what was intended to be a minimum, but that has become the maximum, and then very few of those dollars getting to communities of color. And so that type of behavior by foundations does make me question, like, why does this need to go on in perpetuity? When we have crises happening all around us right now, we see the impacts of the race-wealth gap, all around us in our communities, where communities have been systematically marginalized from these resources for decades. And so I think that any foundation that is going into perpetuity has to really examine themselves and ask why. I really do. I love the idea when foundations go through a process to do that work and they decide to spin down. I think there are great examples of folks who have made that decision and why. And so yeah, I think it's something to be examined. I do think there's a role for philanthropy to play in it's sort of like a reparations kind of model. In the book, I call for an immediate action where foundations could take 10% of their assets, so the $800 billion. If you don't want to spend down, that's a conversation that you want to think through. Well, in the meantime, maybe you could take 10% of the money that you're sitting on and just hand that over to communities of color. There are ways to begin to, I think foundations can play a role in helping to close that race wealth gap, and then also to support some research and some ways of exploring how reparations actually might be something that's feasible to be implemented in this country.
I'm also interested in your thoughts on the concept of market rate returns. It's like market rate for who, like, because of why. It's like usually the question. It's like, well, I want my, I don't want to make a concessionary investment. I want to have a market rate. Can you talk about the problematic? I guess like this is another relic of white supremacy in myself too. Is like there's like this idea that we need to hospice out the old economy and like birth in the new economy, right? So people who are investing in impact but still want market rate returns, you could make an argument that they're sort of like trying to hospice out just pure extractive wealth. But I also get really impatient with those people, and I'm like, well, why don't you just invest in stuff that's like 1% return but is like really high impact? Or can you speak at all, like how do you balance that in your own conversations or your own thought process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it all goes back to like, what is this all about anyway? Like philanthropy, social impact investing, all of that, it's supposed to be about human gain. It's supposed to be about change in communities. That is the return that we're supposed to be looking towards, and not a return on the market. And I tell a story in the book about one foundation that I was working at. And we had, like most private foundations, we paid out 5% of our assets to Grantmaking. And so I don't recall one single time in working there that we had a celebration because like, wow, this was our biggest Grantmaking year ever. We gave away more money. In fact, oh, look what's going on in the world right now. Look, this is a political moment. This is, our communities are suffering at an all-time high. Maybe we'll give out more this year. Rather, there was a focus on the investments and the endowment of the foundation. And every time we hit a certain new level of growth, we would have an ice cream party. And I remember sitting around eating this ice cream thinking like, this is sort of ridiculous. Like, we're celebrating that we are richer versus, having put more money out the door. So those are some of the dynamics that make me question the net value of philanthropy. And beyond sort of like the percentage of returns, which is something to be examined, what folks are actually invested in, like where foundations in particular are investing, is something that is that most people don't realize. For the most part, foundations are actually invested in a way that in industries and in funds that have no type of value attached. And, I can tell you of one foundation in particular, when Standing Rock was happening, they made a generous grant to support, the Native American folks on the ground fighting for their communities. But that same foundation, on the 95% of their, investment side, was invested in the oil company and refused to have a conversation about divesting from that company. And so when you look at, what's actually happening on the investment side, the types of investments that are being made that are counterintuitive to the actual mission of most foundations, I really do wonder what the net value of philanthropy might actually be.
And how has your message been received in the industry? Are you sort of like, are people like turning their heads away or are they welcoming, or what's been your experience so far?
Quite the contrary. I mean, I'll be honest and say in writing this book, I had a lot of anxiety at different times. One, just from remembering my own experiences that I had kind of suppressed or forgotten about, that the book calls me to sort of relive. But also, I decided if I was going to write this book, I was really going to go there and speak truth to power. But also, in my way, and in my way is sort of bringing people in a spirit of love and understanding. But I also feel a sense of urgency to let's talk about what's real, right? Let's get to the heart of this and really try to let's turn on the light, so we can see what is what and then deal with it. And so I was anxious about speaking truth to power. I will say there were a few folks who are leaders in the field that I shared an early copy of the book with, who told me they were concerned for my safety. They were concerned for my career. Some of them they loved the book and they didn't want me to change anything, but they did not want to publicly endorse my book. And so, of course, those early types of reflections made me a little bit more terrified. A couple times I was like, why am I doing this? Am I doing the right thing? But I have to say, Ryan, since the book came out, it's been quite the opposite. I mean, I am speaking at philanthropy and investment conferences all over the country. I just heard earlier this week the publisher is going into the second printing of the book because it's just being sold out in places. And I think people, I think those of us in this work are ready for this conversation, right? We are gotten to, the world is at a certain point that we cannot continue doing business as usual. I think we've been bouncing around ideas of inclusion and diversity and equity for some time. So to really get to the heart of the matter around dismantling white supremacy and really holding up a mirror and asking all of us, all of ourselves, like what is our role in that? How are we participating in that? What do we need to do to make those changes? Is something that I think people are really ready for, the realness of it all. So that's, so I'm really happy with the way that the field has, supported this work.
And can you speak at all? Did you know Peter Buffett and his wife? Is it Jennifer? Or yeah, did you know Peter and Jennifer before, or did you get to know them through the book? Or can you talk a little bit about like how that was? Because they're obviously pretty famous, wealthy people, I guess.
Yeah. And when I was writing the book, I kind of just put together a list of folks I wanted to have a conversation with. I talked to activists. I talked to folks that I felt like were sort of thought leaders or very progressive thinkers around some of these issues. And the Novo Foundation, which is the foundation that Jennifer and Peter started, is a foundation that I've worked with. I know people who work there, and they fund in a way that I think really reflects a lot of the values in this book. And so I was meeting with some of their staff and talking with Pamela Schiffman, who is their executive director, about this work. And she said, Jennifer and Peter, you got to talk to Jennifer and Peter about it. They're going to love this. It's great. And so they wanted to have a meeting, and I drove to their offices for, I think, what was scheduled to be like a 1-hour interview. And I was there for several hours, I think like 5 hours. It was really a magical conversation. And for me, it gave me hope that the change I wanted to see in the world, and especially from folks who have privilege and who have wealth, I grew to understand that there is actually a process that people can go through to understand the responsibility that you have, and to also sort of liberate. Peter often says that they like to take money out of its misery, as a quote that he puts out there a lot. And so I was like, wow, these folks are onto something, that if everyone who had money and privilege and power invested their resources in this kind of way, the world would be a much better place. And then I was, really thrilled to know that their connection to indigenous communities. Peter had written the score to the movie Dances with Wolves, which is sort of this like native, inspired, or a movie that has natives in it. Haven't seen it in some time, but that was sort of his first, kind of first encounter with indigenous people, or at least issues around that movie. And he, began connecting more deeply with sort of indigenous knowledge and communities. And I was like, that's where it is. It's right in my own community. Like, we are resilient. We have a lot of ideas about the economy and existing and taking care of one another, and being in this thing together, in this thing called life together, that I think could actually be the answer to supporting a transformational mind shift in the areas of philanthropy and finance.
Yeah, I think one thing that you spoke to really well, maybe not, explicitly and sort of implied, is I think part of the challenge in philanthropy and social impact investing is sort of a lot of white people in power, or just white people like me, who are like, we don't understand that colonialism or white supremacy does not have to be conscious and intentional to be that. It can be unconscious and unintentional. And that's what majority of white supremacy is. And so I really appreciated you. Can you speak at all about, like, have people come to you and said, like, wow, you helped me realize this that I was doing that, like, I didn't recognize, or any stories that have come up in the past few months around that?
Yeah. And I think you're exactly right, Ryan. I mean, there's obviously, blatant white supremacists, crazy folks out there, right, who are doing terrible things. But I think in general, especially for folks who work in the nonprofit sector, folks who work in the, social impact and philanthropy arenas, tend to have their heart and intentions in the right places. And so much of what may be happening is unconscious. And so, I think what sort of a side effect of this book that I had not intended, and I'll tell this story that's sort of related to your question. But after the election, 2 years ago now, I was feeling kind of angry, right, and upset, and like a lot of people in my community, especially. And I spent some time in my home community in North Carolina. I was talking to an elder of mine about how I was feeling. And I was like, I'm kind of like angry at white people. I don't want to be around a lot of white people right now. I just wanted to be in a bubble of my community. And she really helped me and reminded me of sort of the native value of all my relations. And that is that we're all related. And she's like, Edgar, regardless of how anyone voted, regardless of how different someone may be from you, or how different their background may be from you, they are your relatives, and you have to love them. And so that's a value that I began taking with me into this work, and then writing this book, to understand, man, my community has suffered. There's a lot of trauma, but there's also just pain and suffering everywhere. And if we can actually, those of us who are people of color can actually make space in the movement and be a little, understanding of white folks who are well-meaning but are just unconscious, there might be an opportunity for us to actually bring them in to help them become conscious. I think even on the progressive side of things, we tend to be quite polarized, and we not having the patience for one another, not having grace for one another. And, I was just talking with someone the other day who said, what if right now in 2018, someone was having their wake up moment, right? How would we treat them? Would we bring them in? Or will we, blame and polarize and push them out because they're not quite as progressive as we've come to be? I think for all of us, it's been a journey. I'm from a very conservative family. I'm from the South. I'm from a Native family. And so I have not always seen things the way that I see them now. It's been an evolution. And so, the way that I begin all of these conversations with folks where I'm invited is beginning with a statement, and that is that I will not ever judge you. I will not judge you. I'm not the racial justice police. I'm not the equity police. Anyone who invites me in for a conversation, I see that as a privilege, because if you're wealthy and white, you don't have to be interested in this stuff. You don't have to want to do the right thing, or to understand how our history or our race has had a role in the accumulation of your wealth or in your giving. And so I've been very fortunate. I have sat in the offices of the top of the 1% of this country, and I've been invited in for these conversations because I think that type of approach of, I see the good in you. I know that you're not intentionally wanting to harm communities, but let's have a real conversation about, why people of color may be angry, why things are unjust as they are, and how you have to actually deal with your whiteness. Like you can't you can't have that luxury of not not dealing with the whiteness of it all. And so, but the approach and the spirit of helping folks understand all of that in a non-judgmental way, I think has really been welcomed by a lot of folks.
One of the parts of the book that I got really emotional about and was very powerful for me was the story of the white philanthropist lady who was writing the apology letter and sort of just like dealing with that because I think in the 7 steps to healing, grief is the first one, right? And so I think that's a lot of white Americans, I think, feel that if we start thinking about this, I can't handle the grief, but then we can't even start the 7 steps. Right. Can you tell that story of the woman and like what she sort of was processing and realized?
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you mentioned that. And earlier you mentioned sort of the quick fix, right? Like the white dominant culture way is to say, Edgar, give us the quick steps. We want this to go away. We don't want to feel things. But grief is definitely a part of the process of healing. And we have to acknowledge the hurts that we've endured. We have to acknowledge the role that the accumulation of wealth has played in this country, and kind of reopen those wounds and grieve them in order to get to a place to be able to move forward in a very healthy way. And so, yeah, Hillary is a person who is a trustee of a foundation who has become a friend. And I first met Hillary at a conference. It was actually sort of an indigenous conference. And I was on a panel, and she was on this panel with me. And honestly, when I saw that she was on this panel, my first thought was like, who is this white lady that's on this panel at this Native conference? And all these, other Natives were kind of gloating around her and saying, she was an honorary sister. So I was a little suspicious at first, and thinking that, wow, this is like our space, and why are you here? And so I eventually heard her story and began to open myself to connecting with her. And again, this is my own trauma, right? My own trauma coming into place of not being open, my own, biases. And so long story short, Hillary married into a family with wealth and was kind of grappling with this newfound privilege. And one of the things that she did was to explore where the wealth came from. And she actually found that her family traced back to North Carolina and had owned slaves in the same community where I'm from in North Carolina. And so she was actually moved to, she grieved that. She was like, what a horrible thing to find out. And then how does she begin to grapple with that? And she felt led to then sort of to apologize, knowing that no one may accept her apology. Who, like, people may say, who cares? We don't know you. But she actually wrote a letter to me that I shared an excerpt from in the book, where she apologized to me and to my ancestors, and in a way that on the surface sounds like, wow, like, yeah, like someone saying they're sorry. But it really transformed me because I had never heard that before. As a Native person who is still grappling with extreme poverty in my family, when I visit my family back in North Carolina, I see the decades of oppression like all around. No one has ever apologized or said, I'm sorry that my ancestors had a role in contributing to all of this, right? And so it completely broke down every wall that I had, towards her. And we were able to connect in the way that brought healing to her life and healing to my life. And then the last point I'll say about her is not only did she apologize to me, and then she since has written letters to several other people of color where she's felt led. She apologized to white people, and she apologized for sort of judging them instead of allowing herself, since she kind of like became woke, she became sort of judgmental of other white people. So instead of seeing other white people as her relatives, she began to want to hide away and be more in progressive communities of color. So she also apologized for her sort of cultural amnesia is how she describes it. So I think, those are the two first steps of the 7 steps of healing, that grieving process, becoming aware and like sitting in the discomfort and the grief of that until it works its way through your body and you can get to a place where you're then ready to apologize.
Yeah, it was just that story plus the story of the white guy at the presentation, like showing the slide of the slaves that his family owned. I was crying when I read her story and this guy's story, because I was like, I have had some genealogy done in my family. And in the summary, it was like, and there were slaves in the family. I'm like, okay, like I know that now. And like, that's super embarrassing and shameful. But now it's like, I'm actually pushed to like, I need to know like about this. Like, I can't just say like, oh, I hope, or like, that was the past, I'm different. Like, I need to like sort of understand my own lineage and like the harm. And so I just wanted to thank you for putting those stories in, because I think it's pushed me to say like, I need to know like the names of the slaves that my family owned, and like what is the apology or like reparations or something like it's sort of taken me into like the deep grief. And so I just wanted to thank you for putting those in.
Yeah, there's power in that for sure.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to like keep it somewhat light here, but no, this is good. So next, we got about 5 more minutes left. Let's see. One question I sometimes ask guests is, what do people never ask you that you wish they did?
Wow, that's a really good question. I've been doing a lot of interviews lately, so I'm trying to think of, I think that, I think it's interesting. A lot of, I thought that more people will be interested about my personal life and journey. I do share some of my story in the book, and in a way I sort of hit it and quit it, right? Like I touch on it, but those stories there's so many stories I did not include that were like super painful and whatnot that drove me to write the book. And so I thought that there would be probably more questions about some of those, the juicy stories of like where I was working and what went down there. I'm kind of glad that people haven't asked me those questions, because I think that, I'm talking to a lot of folks who are ideas people, right? And it's like, we don't want to talk about people or places, but we want to talk about the ideas in the book. So that's been like super refreshing. I think only one person has asked me, where do we go from here with this? And the answer is, I really don't know. I think I want to be a part of sort of like a healing campaign. I feel like if this is a message that even outside of business, outside of philanthropy, impact investing space, if we can find a way to popularize this message and get it out there, I think that we can be better neighbors and better family members. And just even like, gosh, I mean, I was getting a haircut today and watching the news about the shooting last night in California. There has to be some type of drastic shift in the way that we are connecting to each other as people in this country. So yeah, I think the question that I'm not getting asked is like, how do we make that happen? And I really don't know. I hope that listeners will, of course, read the book, share ideas, connect with me around helping get this message out. And then I hope that people will just put it to practice and in their lives and with their own families. And so I have been in my own family with my mom, with my brother, others, just practicing this. And it's not. It's hard to have these difficult conversations, and sometimes, especially with people that we love and people that we respect and look up to. And so I'm just interested in hearing back from folks about how we can spread this gospel and how we can make it apply and fit into the various aspects of places where folks are influencing dollars that need to be unleashed and invested into communities that are really hurting. So that was a roundabout way of, I guess I was kind of making an ask of the listeners versus an ask of me, but that is a hope that I wanted to express.
Is there anyone else, any other people that you look to as really leading in this area, that if folks are interested in learning more, they can sort of seek those people out or resources?
Yeah, I mean, oh God, there's so many I think great thought leaders out there who are working in the philanthropy space. Vanessa Daniel is someone that I really respect, who is the executive director of the Groundswell Fund. It's a fund that is supporting, a sort of a feminist fund for women of color and trans women. Vanessa wrote an article called "America is on Fire: White People, What's Your Move?" And every time she writes anything, it's just so powerful and right on. So I think she has an analysis that is very valuable to the idea of racial equity and racial justice in this space. I also lift up, a couple models in the book of funds that are indigenous-led funds, like the Seventh Generation Fund, like the Potlatch Fund. Those are really great models to see where people are actually practicing investing in grant making in a sort of indigenous way. And so check those folks out as well.
Great. And then where can folks learn more about your work? And obviously, everyone, if you have not checked out the book, it's Decolonizing Wealth, Indigenous Wisdom to Heal Divides and Restore Balance. And I highly recommend the audiobook because the gentleman who reads it is excellent. So, yeah. And so where can folks learn more about your work?
So decolonizingwealth.com is a website we put together. There you can find additional blog posts that I've written. We also have different places where I'm speaking and connecting with folks around the country. So please go there, sign up for our newsletter to stay engaged or to connect. The book is available anywhere books are sold. You can definitely order it through the website. And we also just launched some really cool T-shirts that are decolonizer T-shirts. And so the T-shirt and the book, all of the proceeds are supporting Native youth. And so not only am I trying to contribute to shaking up the conversation, I'm using this platform and this opportunity to raise money to support Native youth. And so I invite you to go there and check out the book, as well as get yourself a Decolonizer T-shirt if you want to be a part of this movement to, close the race wealth gap.
Excellent. Well, Edgar, it's been a pleasure having you on the show, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciate it.
That concludes this episode of Next Economy Now, and now on to our mini interview with Doug Bistry, CEO of Clearinghouse CDFI.
Okay, welcome, Doug, to this interview series, the Next Economy Now podcast. And for listeners, I think one of the reasons I'm excited about Clearinghouse CDFI is that you're a lot different than other financial institutions. And so what's the secret sauce then? Because 18 years of profitability, investing in what many maybe other financial institutions would consider risky or something that they're not as interested in. Do you have any sort of principles that have allowed you to stay profitable and while also creating impact in these communities?
Well, I would point to two things. I think our corporate culture and the way we approach business and lending and running this CDFI, I think is critical, and I know we'll talk a little bit about that. But number two, generally too, we are a collateral-based lender. And so we are, while we've done some loans that don't have collateral or have non-traditional collateral, for the most part, most of our lending is collateral-based. And I think that's helped us a lot. We've had, as any lender will, we've had some borrowers that haven't been able to pay us back. And we've had some difficulties with particular loans. But by and large, our credit department has done a great job of identifying ways that we can mitigate the risk, find a way to make a loan. It's difficult, have the security that we know we do have some collateral in case there's an event of default. But, by and large, our loans are performing. And I would say, really our loss rate over our 22-year history is less than 1% of actual losses we've taken. And again, a large part of that is the fact that we are a collateral-based lender.
Wow, less than 1% too. It's incredible. And if we shift to some of the best practice ideas, I think a lot of folks who listen to this interview may want to know things about what you've learned over your 22 years. Is that right?
We're in 22 years.
So one that's a constant struggle or opportunity for companies is building a great employee culture. And I'm wondering if you could speak to what you've learned about how do you build a great employee culture, and are there any unique cultural practices you can speak about?
Yeah, it's such an important thing to me as the president and CEO to identify, support, and try to get buy-in in our corporate culture. It's probably, in the top three things I do as the president and CEO. And so I do spend a lot of time both thinking about it and working on it. And I think, Ryan, what we have done, and I didn't do this out the gate. I think it was actually during the financial crisis. It was probably in about, 2009 or 2010, where I really sat down and I said, I think we have we have a corporate culture, but it wasn't really well articulated. And so, I sat down and worked with some of the people on my team, and I came up with 7 personal corporate cultural traits, and that would be things that we expect from our employees, and 7 business corporate cultural traits. And they're written down, they're identified. And when I hire any new employee at any level, within 30 days, I sit down with that employee. And if there's 2 or 3 hires at the same time, we have a group of them. And I walk through these corporate cultural traits and explain to them that, this is who we are, this is our company, and this is what we expect. And I think, I don't know if that's unique or not, but it's been something that I'm very proud of, and I think it has helped us create a great employee culture.
And where can folks learn more about Clearinghouse and, say if there's any investors who are interested, what's the best way for them to get in contact?
We have a great website that has a ton of information, including our financials. It is www.ccdfi.com. Again, that's ccdfi.com. And a lot of information there. There's contact numbers. I'd be happy to talk to anybody that is serious about investing or working with us. And also, we're looking for projects to lend, good projects. And so And our service area is California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, and all of Indian country throughout the United States. So if anyone is aware of an unmet credit need that has good community impact, or, often our loans are made to entrepreneurs, people of color, or members of groups that have been disenfranchised. And if anyone is aware of loans, boy, we'd love to hear from them as well.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. Lift is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. To listen to all our past episodes or to share your thoughts about the show with us, visit www.lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. It's really very helpful in allowing these ideas to reach a wider audience. Once again, thanks for listening.